It always begins with something small, something almost forgettable. A word murmured under the breath, a glance that lingers too long, a laugh that carries an echo you can't explain. Tonight, as I tell you this story, know that we truly love you, and we're here just to keep you company. You matter more than you realize, and the simple act of resting now is enough. This tale will drift between shadows and starlight, memories and dreams. The nights of childhood are never quite the same once you begin to notice the hum inside the walls. For most, it is dismissed as pipes settling, the murmur of an old house leaning into its age. But for him, it was something softer, almost deliberate, like the faint echo of a lullaby sung in a language he did not know. It was not loud enough to frighten, never sharp, never demanding attention, but present all the same, threading itself through the quiet. The sound lingered just beneath the edge of waking thought, like the breath of someone who cares, hovering at the border of sleep. He would lie still, his eyes tracing shapes in the ceiling where cracks crossed like constellations, and let the tones of that unseen song cradle him. It wasn't music in the ordinary sense. It shifted slowly like light bending in water, never repeating the same way twice. Some nights it was low and steady, as if the house was sighing with him. Other nights it rose just slightly, a hum almost playful, carrying hints of laughter and forgotten comfort. He never asked anyone else if they heard it, not his family, not even the sibling who sometimes curled up at the foot of his bed on stormy evenings. It felt private, a secret woven for him alone, and he feared that naming it aloud might cause it to disappear. In the mornings, he would carry the memory of that hum with him, the way one carries the aftertaste of something sweet. At school, when the world was too loud, too quick, he would close his eyes for a moment and recall the gentle sound, steadying himself as if leaning against an invisible wall that only he knew was there. The other children did not understand why he seemed so calm, so unbothered when teased or when games grew too rough. He had learned to let the noise of the world pass over him, the way the hum passed through walls without breaking them. There was one afternoon when his sibling noticed. She sat beside him, watching him draw spirals on the back of an old envelope, his pencil never lifting, the circles looping endlessly inward.
"Why do you draw the same thing over and over?"
she asked. He didn't look up. Instead, he whispered, "Because it makes the sound stay." She tilted her head, confused, but said nothing more. In her silence, he felt understood in a way words never could. That small exchange would stay with him for years, tucked away like a folded note in the pocket of his memory. The hum became more than comfort. It became a rhythm by which he measured time. He began to notice it most clearly at dusk, when the world shifted between day and night, when even the birds seemed uncertain whether to keep singing or fall quiet. That was when the house breathed most audibly, when the tune threaded through the walls and into his chest. He would sit near the window, watching shadows stretch long across the yard, and let the sound fill the space inside him that always seemed hungry for something unnamed. Sometimes he wondered if the sound came from within him instead of the walls. Perhaps it was the echo of his own thoughts, returning softened, gentler than they began. If so, he felt grateful, as if some kinder version of himself was singing back to him, reassuring him that he would be okay. Other times, he thought of it as a gift left behind by someone he never met, a legacy tucked into the bones of the building itself. He liked not knowing for sure. Mystery gave the sound weight, and the weight gave him comfort. As seasons changed, so did the hum. In winter, it carried a low, steady warmth, the kind that matched the hush of snow settling against the window panes. In spring, it seemed to rise and fall, like the tentative songs of birds finding their voices again. In summer, it softened almost to silence, mingling with the drone of cicadas, hiding in plain hearing. And in autumn, It carried a faint melancholy, a reminder that everything beautiful carries with it the promise of change. Each shift shaped him quietly, teaching him to listen not only with his ears but with his whole being, to attune to subtleties others overlooked. There were nights when his sibling joined him, both of them lying awake staring at the same ceiling constellations. She never said she heard the sound, but she sometimes hummed absent-mindedly, a tune with no beginning or end. He suspected she might have caught pieces of it, faint traces that brushed her without settling fully. The thought made him smile. Even if the sound belonged only to him, sharing its shadow with her felt like sharing a dream that could never be fully described, yet somehow was still understood. Over time, the hum became a guide. When decisions weighed on him, when uncertainty pressed heavy, he would pause and wait for the sound to rise within the walls. It never gave him answers, but it slowed his racing thoughts, reminding him that stillness has a wisdom of its own. He learned patience not through lessons or scoldings, but through listening. He discovered that even silence could sing, and that every song carries within it a kind of trust, that the note you're hearing now will lead gently into the next. As adolescence crept in, bringing with it the awkward tangle of emotions, the hum remained a steady thread. It didn't soothe away his feelings, nor did it erase his worries. Instead, it let him hold them more softly, as if saying, "You don't need to solve everything tonight. You can rest, and the world will keep." He began to carry that message into his interactions with others. Friends noticed his calm presence, his way of listening without judgment, and leaned on him when their own storms grew too strong. He never spoke of the hum, but in a way, he became the echo of it for them, gentle, steady, and quietly reassuring. One evening, his sibling asked him why he never shouted, why he never fought back when others teased him. He thought for a long moment before answering. "Because when the walls sing, I remember that not everything needs a fight." She frowned, not entirely satisfied with the explanation, but she reached for his hand and held it.
That was enough.
Sometimes understanding doesn't come through clarity, but through closeness. The years continued, and though the hum remained, it changed in tone, becoming quieter, less distinct, like a dream recalled upon waking. Yet even as it softened, its influence deepened. It had taught him that every space carries more than what is visible, that every life hums with its own quiet music. He carried this truth gently, never forcing it on others, but living it, embodying it in the way he treated people, with patience, with listening, with care. And in the deepest part of night, when the world was hushed, and even his thoughts began to drift apart like scattered feathers, he still found it there, tucked in the edges of silence. A lullaby without words, a gift without explanation. He closed his eyes and let it carry him, not needing to know where it came from, only trusting that it was enough. He remembered the first time he felt the warmth of another heart resting quietly beside his own. Childhood can be lonely, filled with echoes and unanswered questions, but sometimes a single bond becomes the thread that carries you through. For him, that bond was his sibling. She was younger by a little more than a year, yet her laughter seemed older, like it carried knowledge she couldn't put into words. He didn't always understand her, and she didn't always understand him, but they leaned toward each other like two trees bending together in the wind, steadying one another in ways too subtle to measure. Their conversations were often incomplete, fragments left hanging in the air, but the silences in between were more meaningful than explanations. Once, as they sat on the porch steps while evening fell, she whispered, "I don't like it when the dark feels empty." He thought about that for a moment, then simply said, "It isn't empty."
There's always something singing. She didn't ask what he meant, didn't press him for proof.
Instead, she rested her head against his shoulder, and together they listened to the stillness as if it were enough. Over the years, Their companionship deepened in ways neither of them needed to define. On days when she felt restless, when her feet seemed eager to run toward places she didn't know, he walked with her down winding roads that led nowhere in particular. On days when his thoughts grew heavy, pressing like clouds before rain, she would distract him with stories that made no sense at all, but always made him smile. They stitched a kind of language together, one that belonged only to them, a language of gestures, pauses, unfinished sentences, and laughter that seemed to answer questions better than any words could. There was a small park near their home where they often went. The swings were rusted, the slide long forgotten, but the trees held pockets of shade that felt like secret rooms. They would sit beneath those branches, sharing small treasures, a feather found in the grass, a stone shaped like a heart, a sandwich split unevenly, but always offered with care. He noticed how she seemed to carry light with her, a brightness that softened even his most uncertain moods. And though he never told her, he sometimes wondered if she was part of the hum in the walls, a living note in the lullaby that steadied him through the years. She had quirks that others overlooked but that he cherished. She collected bits of string and tied them to her wrist until it looked like a bracelet woven by time itself. She hummed nonsense tunes when she was nervous, tilting her head like a bird listening to the wind. She believed clouds could hold secrets if you stared at them long enough. These things that made her unusual also made her precious. He admired how she never tried to hide them, how she wore her strangeness openly, like a badge that reminded the world she was unafraid to be exactly who she was. He knew even then that bonds like theirs were rare. Not because they never argued, they did, sometimes fiercely, but because the arguments never tore the fabric of their closeness. A quarrel was only another thread in the weave, pulled taut for a moment, but always absorbed into the larger pattern of their connection. He remembered one evening when they fought about something small, though the details were forgotten. She stormed away, and he sat alone on the steps, feeling the night grow colder without her presence. Minutes later she returned, carrying 2 mismatched cups of water. She handed one to him and said, "We shouldn't go thirsty." They both laughed, and just like that, the fight melted into memory. It was never about being right. It was about staying together. As they grew older, their paths began to stretch in different directions, as paths often do. She sought adventure, new people, new experiences, while he leaned toward stillness, preferring the familiar comfort of home. Yet even as their days diverged, their nights always found a way back to one another. They would sit quietly, sometimes in the same room, sometimes only near enough to sense each other's presence, and the unspoken bond reminded them that distance could never undo what time had carefully woven. He often thought of her as the mirror through which he understood himself. Without her laughter, he might have forgotten joy. Without her restlessness, he might have never learned to see beyond his own quiet world. She drew him outward, nudged him into noticing the brightness of days he would have otherwise overlooked, and in return, he gave her something she needed but never asked for. The calm assurance that someone would always wait for her, that no matter how far she wandered, there was a place where she was already understood. One summer evening, they lay in the grass, watching stars bleed slowly into the sky. She whispered, "Do you think the stars remember us?" He turned his head, saw her eyes reflecting those tiny lights, and replied softly, "Maybe we remember them instead. Maybe that's enough." She nodded, and though no further words were spoken, both of them carried that moment quietly, as if it had carved a small, permanent space in their hearts. As the years continued, she found friends who pulled her toward different circles, while he remained a steady presence at home. Yet even when surrounded by others, she often returned to him, seeking the kind of stillness only he seemed to hold. And when his own days felt heavy, when he wondered about the strange hum in the walls or the shifting purpose of his life. He found reassurance in the simple fact that she still turned to him, still trusted him to understand even when he could not explain. There came a day when she left for longer than usual, her absence stretching into weeks. The house felt emptier, the hum fainter, as though the walls themselves missed her presence. He walked the same paths, sat beneath the same trees, but without her beside him, the spaces seemed unfinished. Yet he held on to patience, trusting what their bond had taught him, that love is not measured by proximity, but by the constancy of care. When she returned at last, carrying stories too tangled to recount, he did not ask for explanations. He only listened, nodding gently, letting her words fall where they wished. She sighed in relief, resting her head on his shoulder just as she had years ago, and he realized that nothing had truly changed. Through her, he had learned that relationships are not defined by perfection, but by persistence, by the willingness to return again and again to one another's side. He had also learned that love, in its truest form, is quiet. It doesn't demand, doesn't insist, it simply remains. Their bond became his compass, guiding him through the uncertainties of growing older, teaching him to value connection over achievement, presence over grandeur. And even now, when he closed his eyes at night, he could feel the echo of her laughter, hear the faint rhythm of her humming, sense the nearness of her heart. She was more than his sibling. She was proof that no one has to face the dark alone. Together, they had built a sanctuary of understanding, a space where words were never as important as the comfort of knowing someone was there. And in that sanctuary, he felt the hum of the walls more clearly than ever before, not just a song for him alone, but a harmony they had created together. The world outside never felt quite solid to him. Streets curved into one another like folded paper, familiar houses seemed to shift when he blinked, and the air itself often carried a strangeness that others didn't notice. For most, the town was ordinary, a place of shops, sidewalks and trees lining the quiet avenues. But for him, it was something more fluid, like a dream that hadn't quite decided what it wanted to become. He never spoke of it aloud, but he carried the sense that the world leaned, ever so slightly, toward wonder. When he walked to school, he sometimes felt as though the pavement stretched longer than the day before, as if the road itself wanted him to linger. Other times, the walk was brief, as though the ground folded itself up to carry him quicker to where he needed to be. The sky played tricks too. Clouds shifted into shapes so precise they felt like messages meant only for him. Faces, animals, doorways that faded as soon as he blinked. He wondered whether anyone else noticed, whether others saw the same quiet bending of reality, or if it was another secret, like the hum in the walls. This gentle strangeness didn't frighten him. If anything, it gave him comfort. It was proof that the world was alive, that it was not simply made of stone and wood, but of something breathing and attentive. When the wind stirred the leaves, he sometimes heard patterns in the sound, as if the branches were holding conversations above his head. On evenings when the light dimmed slowly, he felt as though the air itself leaned close, waiting for him to listen. It wasn't loud or urgent, never demanding belief.
It simply was.
And he, being patient by nature, accepted its presence without the need to understand. Others seemed not to notice. His friends spoke of schoolwork, of games, of small rivalries that filled their days, and he listened kindly, nodding, smiling when they laughed. But beneath their words, he held his own quiet awareness that the world was layered, more mysterious than they realized. He didn't resent their blindness. He only felt a tenderness toward them, as though they were missing a lullaby that had always been there. Sometimes he wished he could share it, but he knew such things could not be explained. They could only be felt. His sibling, however, sensed more than she admitted. She would pause on walks, staring at the way shadows bent across the ground, tilting her head as if listening to something no one else could hear. Once she asked him softly, "Do you think the world changes when we're not looking?" He answered without hesitation, "Yes, I think it moves so slowly we can only notice if we're patient enough." She smiled at that, not asking for proof, only accepting the possibility. In moments like these, he felt less alone in his strange perception, grateful that she carried at least a fragment of the same wonder. There was a place at the edge of town where the world's strangeness showed itself most clearly. An old bridge crossed a shallow stream, its wooden boards warped with age, its railing missing in places. Few people walked there anymore, preferring the newer paths. But he found himself drawn to it again and again. When he stood on the bridge at dusk, he swore the water below moved in slow motion, its ripples stretching longer than they should, carrying reflections that lingered even after the shapes above had changed. Once he leaned over the edge and whispered into the stream. The water carried his voice away, bending the sound so that it seemed to echo faintly from somewhere downstream. It felt like the world was whispering back, acknowledging his presence. The strangeness of the world shaped him gently, teaching him patience and awe. He began to see how small things held meaning if you gave them enough time. A feather drifting to the ground became a map of the wind's invisible path. The way the sun slid behind rooftops was a lesson in endings that were never abrupt, only gradual, like a sigh. Even the silence between footsteps carried a rhythm if you paid attention. These observations did not make him separate from others. Instead, they made him softer toward them. He realized that everyone carried their own strange perceptions, even if they didn't speak of them. Some noticed colors more vividly. Some remembered scents long after they had faded. Some felt time differently, rushing or stretching in ways that never quite matched the clock. The world, he thought, revealed itself uniquely to each heart. At times he wondered if the bending of the world was tied to him, if perhaps his own presence influenced it, made it shift in small ways. But he never felt burdened by the thought. Instead, he saw it as a kind of friendship, an agreement between him and the spaces he walked through. He gave the world his attention, and in return, the world showed him its quiet secrets. It was not a transaction, not something earned, but a shared intimacy, the kind that blooms when trust is given freely. He carried this sense into his relationships. When a friend spoke to him, he listened fully, as though their words were as delicate as the ripples in the stream. When his sibling shared her restless dreams of leaving town, he did not dismiss her but held the words with care, knowing they meant more than ambition. They were songs of longing, echoes of the same strangeness he felt, only expressed differently. His patience became his gift, and though he never thought of it as remarkable, others began to notice the way he made them feel seen. The world, in its dreamlike shifting, gave him practice in noticing what others missed. He saw when someone's smile faltered, when their hands fidgeted, when silence weighed heavier than words. He responded not with explanations, but with presence, offering the same stillness the world had taught him. Over time, people began to gravitate toward him, not because he solved their problems, but because he reminded them of something they couldn't name, something steady, something kind, and yet he remained aware of how strange it all was. Sometimes, when walking alone, he would laugh softly, shaking his head at the impossibility of it all. "Why me?" he would ask the air, though no answer came. But perhaps no answer was needed. The mystery itself was enough. To live within a world that shifted, to walk on streets that lengthened or shortened, to hear whispers in the branches, it all reminded him that life was not fixed. It was alive, bending, unfolding, always carrying more than what could be seen. That knowledge was both humbling and comforting. On nights when sleep came slowly, he would recall the bridge, the way the stream stretched its reflections, the way the world seemed to lean close when he paid attention. He would let that memory fill him, softening the edges of his thoughts until dreams carried him away. And somewhere in those dreams, he felt certain the world continued to bend gently around him, holding him the way a lullaby holds a child. Not tightly, not with urgency, but with the quiet assurance that everything belonged. Even the strangeness, even the mystery. There was an older man who often sat at the far end of the park, near the weathered bench where the shade stretched longest in the afternoons. His presence was quiet, never intrusive, and yet he seemed to draw the boy's eyes without effort. The man's hair was silver, not in the polished way of youth gone grey, but in the softened, weathered way of someone who had lived through many seasons. He carried himself with a patience that mirrored the hum of the walls, a rhythm unhurried, as though he knew that the world would come to him in its own time. At first, the boy only observed him from a distance, curious but not ready to approach. The man's hands often held something small, a book, a folded paper, sometimes just a stone. He turned slowly between his fingers. He seemed to treat every object with reverence, as if nothing was too ordinary to deserve his attention. That small act was enough to awaken a sense of recognition in the boy. He thought, here is someone who listens the way I do. It was his sibling who nudged him forward one day. "Why don't you talk to him?" she asked, her eyes following the man's slow movements. The boy hesitated. Words were not easy for him when the heart felt so full. But her suggestion stayed with him, and the next afternoon he found himself walking toward the bench. The man looked up as he approached, his gaze kind but steady. There was no surprise, no demand, only welcome. "The shadows are long today," the man said softly, as if continuing a conversation already in motion. The boy nodded, unsure how to reply, but sat beside him without asking permission. From that moment, a quiet companionship began. The man did not ask questions. He didn't probe into the boy's thoughts or force conversation into shapes it didn't want to take. Instead, he offered fragments, short sentences that carried more than they seemed. "Leaves fall when they're ready. Still water remembers the sky. Even silence has a voice if you let it." These phrases might have sounded strange to others, but to the boy they were anchors. They carried the same quality as the hum in the walls, mysterious, yet deeply reassuring. Over time, the boy began to speak as well, not in long streams, but in small offerings. He told the man about the way the bridge seemed to stretch, about the sound in the walls, about how clouds sometimes looked like doorways. The man never laughed, never dismissed, only listened, with eyes that seemed to hold entire skies. Occasionally he would respond with another fragment, "What bends is not broken," or "Sometimes what you hear is your own heart finding its way back." The boy never asked what these phrases meant. He only absorbed them, letting them settle where they would. His sibling noticed the change in him. "You smile differently now," she said one evening as they walked home. He didn't know how to explain it. It wasn't that the man had given him answers. It was that the man had given him permission to wonder without needing answers at all. And that was enough to shift something inside him, to let his questions breathe without urgency. The seasons continued their slow turning. In winter, the man sat wrapped in an old coat, his breath visible in the air, yet still present on the same bench. In spring, blossoms drifted onto his shoulders, and he brushed them away without hurry. The boy began to feel that the man was part of the park itself, as rooted as the trees, as constant as the stream. It comforted him, knowing there was someone who held time so gently. One day, the boy asked, "Why do you always sit here?" The man smiled faintly, his eyes following a bird in flight. "Because this place listens. Most places don't, but here the air waits. And when you sit long enough, you realize waiting is its own kind of gift." The boy thought about that for a long while. He realized then that the man was teaching him not through lessons, but through presence, showing him that stillness can be more powerful than motion. The boy began to carry these teachings into his own life. At home, when his sibling grew restless and impatient, he would remind her gently, "The air waits. We can wait too." At school, when noise and competition rose around him, he sat calmly, letting the storm pass through without clinging to it. His friends noticed, though they couldn't name the change. They said he seemed older somehow, as if he carried a secret they were not yet ready to hear. Yet the man never claimed to be a teacher. He never demanded respect or gratitude. He only shared time, shared silence, and allowed wisdom to surface in its own shape. The boy admired that deeply. So many people filled space with noise, with explanations and arguments, but the man seemed to know that the quietest words were the ones that lasted longest. One afternoon, the man handed the boy a small stone, smooth and pale, shaped vaguely like a tear. "Keep this," he said.
Not because it's special,
"But because it will remind you that even ordinary things can be carried with care." The boy held the stone carefully, feeling its cool weight in his palm. It was not the object that mattered. It was the gesture, the reminder that attention itself is a kind of love. Years later, he would still carry that stone in his pocket, a silent reminder of those afternoons. Whenever he touched it, he remembered the way the man's voice blended with the rustle of leaves, the way stillness itself could feel alive. It became a talisman not of answers, but of presence. There came a time when the man stopped appearing on the bench. The boy went to the park several days in a row, waiting, listening, but the space was empty. At first, he felt a pang of loss, sharp and sudden, as though a thread had been cut. But then he remembered the man's words. "Still water remembers the sky." He realized that absence, too, carries its own kind of presence. The lessons were not gone. They had only shifted inward, becoming part of him. He told his sibling about it, and she held his hand quietly. "Maybe he was only meant to stay until you learned how to listen," she said. He nodded, feeling both sorrow and gratitude, a blend of emotions that softened rather than hardened him. He understood now that not every bond is meant to last forever in the same form. Some arrive for a season, shaping us, and then leave us with gifts we carry forward. When he lay in bed that night, listening to the hum in the walls, he felt the man's presence in the sound. It was not literal, he knew that, but it was real in the way memory is real, in the way love lingers even when the person is gone. He smiled faintly in the dark, holding the smooth stone in his hand. The world outside bent and shifted as it always had, but inside he felt steady. He had learned that listening itself was a form of strength, and that strength was not loud, not forceful, but gentle and enduring. And so the boy grew, carrying forward the quiet wisdom of an unlikely mentor, a wisdom that whispered not of answers, but of patience, not of certainty, but of presence. And in the quiet spaces of his life, he would hear the echo again. Not everything needs to be solved. Some things are simply meant to be carried, like a song with no end, like a stone with no purpose, but to remind you to care. The boy began to notice how the world spoke in ways that most people hurried past. It wasn't only in the walls of his room or the silver-haired man's quiet phrases, but in the unnoticed spaces that filled his days. The swing at the edge of the schoolyard creaked not with rust, but with memory, its voice stretching each time the chains moved. The trees near the river held conversations with the wind, bending and sighing as though they had stories too old for human tongues. Even the stones on the path seemed to hum faintly when he pressed his palm against them, as if the earth itself was never silent, only waiting for someone to listen. His sibling began to walk with him more often, curious about what he heard. "Show me," she would whisper. And so he did, though he knew it was less about showing and more about slowing down. Together they paused beside dripping gutters, listening to the rhythm of water as though it were a song. They leaned against brick walls warmed by the sun, feeling the faint thrum hidden within. At first, she teased him gently, saying he imagined it, but gradually her teasing turned into wonder. She too began to hear the subtle echoes, to sense the vibrations lingering beneath ordinary surfaces. One evening, as dusk spread across the rooftops, the boy and his sibling sat side by side, their legs dangling over the edge of the old bridge. "It feels like the world is speaking secrets," she said softly. He nodded, smiling faintly. "It always has. We just weren't listening." Her hand brushed against his, and for a moment they were united in stillness, suspended between water and sky, between what they knew and what remained a mystery. At home, their parents noticed the change in them. There was less restlessness, less clamor. The boy and his sibling had learned to linger in silence, to exchange fewer words but with greater weight. Their parents sometimes worried that the children were drifting into strange habits, too quiet, too thoughtful for their age. But when they saw the calmness in their faces, the soft glow in their eyes, the worry dissolved. Something was being nurtured, though they could not name it. The boy often wondered about the silver-haired man. Though the man no longer appeared on the park bench, his presence seemed woven into the boy's days. Every time he noticed a hidden rhythm, every time he remembered to pause instead of rushing forward, it felt like the man was still there, smiling faintly, repeating one of his fragmentary truths. He thought often of the phrase, "Still water remembers the sky." He did not yet understand it fully, but he carried it the way one carries a lantern through the dark, trusting it to reveal its meaning over time. As weeks turned into months, the boy began to dream differently. His nights were filled with images that lingered long after waking, a staircase that wound into the clouds, a library where books whispered their own names, a field where every blade of grass shimmered like glass. In these dreams he never felt fear. Instead, he felt a sense of invitation, as though the world of sleep was simply another way the universe spoke. Sometimes he told his sibling about the dreams, and she listened with rapt attention. Sometimes she shared her own, of doorways that opened into starlight, of rivers that ran backwards into the past. They marveled at how their inner worlds began to echo the same strangeness as the outer one. It was during one of these dreams that the boy felt the most startling closeness to the man from the park. He dreamt of the old bench, but this time it was empty, surrounded by a meadow of tall grass that swayed without wind. In the dream, he sat on the bench himself, and the hum of the walls followed him there. It was louder than ever, not frightening, but vast, like a heartbeat stretched across the whole earth. He woke with the stone in his hand, warm as if it too had been dreaming. The next morning, he told his sibling about it. She nodded thoughtfully and said, "Maybe he gave you the stone so you could carry him with you into your dreams." He considered this and felt a quiet agreement. Objects, he realized, could hold more than their physical weight. They could carry presence, memory, even love. The children began to collect their own small objects. A feather caught in the fence, a bottle cap glinting in the grass, a piece of driftwood shaped like a spiral. They kept them in a box beneath their bed, not for treasure, not for value, but for the reminder that even the simplest things could hum with meaning. Each item seemed to carry its own voice, waiting to be heard. In the world outside, life went on with its familiar noise. People hurried to work, to school, to errands. Cars rumbled, voices rose, doors slammed. The boy noticed how little most people paused, how easily the hidden rhythms were drowned out. At first, this saddened him. He wanted to shake them gently and say, "Listen, don't you hear it?" But then he remembered the man's way, never demanding, never forcing, only offering presence. So he chose not to push. Instead, he carried his listening quietly, like a secret lantern, illuminating only for those who wished to see. His sibling, however, sometimes grew impatient with the world's noise.
Why can't they stop for even a moment?
She would ask in frustration. He would place a hand on her shoulder, repeating what he once learned. The air waits. We can wait too. She would sigh, then smile reluctantly, and together they would retreat to a quieter place until the storm of sound passed. In these moments the boy realized how much of the man's wisdom had rooted itself in him, not as instructions but as a way of being. There came a day when the children decided to visit the park again, not in search of the man but in search of the stillness he had shared with them. They walked slowly along the path, noticing the soft crunch of gravel, the flutter of birds, the way sunlight filtered through leaves in shifting patterns. When they reached the bench, it was empty, but they sat together, closing their eyes, letting the silence wrap around them. And in that silence, they felt it, the presence of everything, the voice of the world humming beneath their skin. It was not absence they felt, but fullness. The boy realized then that the man had never truly left. He was woven into the rhythm of the park, into the hum of the walls, into the quiet truths carried by ordinary things. And more than that, he was alive in the boy himself, in his sibling, in the way they listened. He understood now what the man had meant when he said,
Even silence has a voice. That voice was not outside them anymore. It was within.
Waiting, steady, endless. When they left the park, the evening sky stretched wide, painted in strokes of violet and gold. The boy carried the stone in his pocket. His sibling carried the feather she had found, and together they walked slowly, savoring the rhythm of their steps. The world was not less mysterious now. It was more so, but in a way that no longer frightened them. They had learned that mystery was not an enemy to be solved, but a companion to be cherished. And as night settled with stars blinking awake, the boy lay in bed, listening once more to the hum in the walls. It no longer felt like a question without answer. It felt like a song, one he had always known, one that would carry him gently through every season yet to come. Laughter has a way of arriving when it is least expected, slipping through the cracks of solemn days like sunlight between clouds. For the boy, it often came in small moments, in the sideways glance of his sibling, in the half-hidden smiles of strangers who didn't even realize they had given something precious away. He began to realize that laughter, like the hum in the walls, carried its own quiet echo. It softened sharp edges. It reminded him that even in mystery there could be warmth, and in warmth there could be joy. There could be joy. One afternoon, when the air was heavy with the scent of rain, his sibling decided to test how far their patience and stillness could stretch. She balanced a slice of bread on her nose, crossing her eyes to keep it steady, and then toppled backward in mock defeat. The boy laughed so suddenly that he startled himself, the sound ringing louder than he had ever heard it. His sibling laughed too, rolling on the floor until tears formed. The hum of the world wrapped around their laughter, and for once, instead of blending quietly, it seemed to sing in harmony with them. Their parents peeked into the room, smiling despite themselves. "What are you two doing?" their father asked. The sibling sat up, still giggling. "Learning balance," she replied with solemnity, though the bread clung to her cheek like a badge of silliness. Their father shook his head, but his eyes glimmered with fondness. Their mother whispered, "Let them laugh. It's good for them." And so they did, long after the bread had fallen, long after the moment should have ended. The boy noticed that laughter carried memory differently from silence. Silence was steady, like a stone.
Laughter was fleeting, like a bird, but it left feathers behind.
Days later, he could still feel the echo of that bread-balanced silliness fluttering in his chest, reminding him that joy could anchor just as firmly as sorrow. At school, he began to watch how others laughed. Some laughed with their whole bodies, shoulders shaking, eyes squeezed shut. Others laughed only with their mouths thin and careful. A few hardly laughed at all, their smiles small and uncertain. The boy wondered about those children, whether they carried too much weight inside, or whether they simply hadn't yet discovered the secret voices of the world that might coax laughter from them. He began to test gentle ways of sharing it.
A funny tilt of his head.
A whisper of a joke that wasn't really a joke. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. But even when it failed, he could feel that the attempt mattered. His sibling, braver than he was, often tried grander experiments. She painted faces on stones and left them on windowsills where people might find them. She drew comical eyes on the fruit in the kitchen, arranging them in scenes of drama and mischief. Their parents scolded at first, but eventually grew accustomed to the sight of an orange staring solemnly at them from the counter. What mattered most was that the house felt lighter. The walls still hummed, but now they carried not only mystery, but also a playful rhythm, as though amused by the antics inside. One evening, as twilight settled, the boy sat with his sibling by the fire. The flames crackled, and in the shifting glow he thought of the silver-haired man again. He wondered if the man had ever laughed the way they did now, if his solemn phrases had once been punctuated by joy. His sibling must have sensed his thought, because she leaned against him and said, "Do you think he ever told a joke?" The boy smiled faintly. Maybe his whole life was a kind of joke. Not cruel, just gentle, like the world teasing us. They both laughed softly at the idea, not mocking, but cherishing. It felt right somehow that wisdom and laughter might be siblings too. In the days that followed, the boy began to realize that laughter was its own form of resilience. When the world pressed heavy on his shoulders, when classmates mocked his quietness, or when teachers grew impatient with his drifting thoughts, he found that even a small smile could keep him steady. His siblings' mischievous eyes, his parents' reluctant grins, the memory of bread balanced foolishly, all of it lived within him as armor. Not hard armor, not cold, but something soft and elastic, bending without breaking. Sometimes he would walk alone to the park and sit on the old bench, letting his mind drift back to those shared moments. The hum of the earth seemed to carry echoes of laughter now, as though every giggle, every chuckle, every burst of joy anyone had ever released was woven into the fabric of sound. It comforted him to imagine the world storing laughter the way it stored rainfall and starlight. Nothing was ever lost. One rainy afternoon, his sibling grew frustrated at the greyness. "It's too quiet," she complained. "Even the walls sound sad." The boy thought for a moment, then began humming a tune he had once heard their mother sing absent-mindedly. The sibling joined in, off-key but bright, and soon their laughter spilled over the melody. The rain became their percussion drumming against the roof. It was silly, chaotic, and imperfect, yet in that imperfection lay something beautiful. The hum of the walls grew warmer, as if even the house itself had joined their impromptu band. The boy realized then that laughter was not always loud. Sometimes it hid inside a smile, or in the quiet relief of understanding, or in the way two people could share a glance that said everything. It was a spectrum wide and shifting, and within that spectrum there was always space for healing. Their mother, one evening after supper, sat with them and sighed, her face lined with fatigue. She rarely spoke of her burdens, but that night she whispered, "I'm so tired." Without words, the boy reached for the bread, balancing it on his nose as his sibling once had. His sibling caught on instantly, adding her own flair by crossing her eyes dramatically. Their mother blinked at them, confused, then burst into laughter so sudden it brought tears. She covered her face, laughing harder than they had ever heard before. Their father entered the room, bewildered, and soon joined in too. For a long time they all laughed together, the kind of laughter that loosened knots, that softened years of weariness. When it faded, their mother looked younger somehow, lighter. She kissed them both on the forehead and said, "Thank you." The boy understood then that laughter was not only for themselves. It was a gift they could give. As night fell, the boy lay awake, listening to the softened hum around him. He realized how different it felt now compared to the early days of confusion. It was no longer only a question in the dark. It was a chorus. The hum held echoes of stillness, of wisdom, and now of laughter. He thought of the silver-haired man again, and for the first time, instead of seeing him solemnly on the bench, he imagined him laughing softly, shoulders shaking, eyes crinkled. The image warmed him. He drifted to sleep with the certainty that laughter, like silence, was a kind of language. Both could speak what words could not. Both could connect hearts across time. And as dreams claimed him, he carried that truth gently, like a lantern that glowed not with fire, but with joy. Wandering is not always about distance. Sometimes it is the quiet shift between who you were and who you are becoming, a gentle drifting through unseen corridors of the self. The boy felt this truth settle over him as seasons turned, as laughter faded into memory and silence grew spacious again. He began to walk farther from home, following paths he did not know, not to escape, but to listen. Each road, each trail, each forgotten corner of the town seemed to hum with its own secret note. He wandered not to arrive, but to witness. The first time he crossed the field beyond the school, the grass reached his waist, bending like an ocean. With each step, the blades parted and closed, whispering in voices that only he and perhaps the wind could hear. He paused often, pressing his palms against the earth, sensing the faint heartbeat beneath. The hum was always there, steady and sure, but it carried different textures depending on where he stood. Here, in the open field, it was wide and low, like a drumbeat stretched across the horizon. His sibling sometimes joined him on these wanderings, though she was quicker to tire. "You walk like the earth is your book," she teased one afternoon as they followed a narrow stream. He smiled but said nothing. She was right. Every stone, every bend in the water, every shadow cast by trees felt like a page filled with meaning. Some words he could read, others he only sensed, like half-remembered dreams. At times, wandering brought him into contact with strangers. A woman knitting on a porch lifted her eyes to meet his, offering a smile so gentle it felt like a gift. A boy flying a kite let him hold the string for a moment, the pull of wind tugging at both their hands. An old man sweeping his shop doorway paused to tell him about the weather, about how the clouds always carried their own stories if one learned how to watch. These encounters were brief, fleeting, yet each added to the rhythm he was learning. They reminded him that the world was not only hums and silences, but also the quiet generosity of passing souls. At evening, after a long day of wandering, he reached the edge of a forest he had never entered before. The trees loomed tall, their branches interlocking like the beams of an ancient cathedral. He hesitated, but curiosity outweighed caution, and he stepped inside. The forest was hushed, in a way unlike any place he had known. The hum was there, but muffled, deep, as though buried beneath layers of roots and soil. He walked slowly, touching bark, listening to leaves rustle faintly overhead. It felt like walking into a memory older than himself, older than anyone, older than himself, older than anyone. In the forest, time loosened. Minutes slipped into hours without notice. He found a fallen log and sat, watching ants carry fragments of leaves, watching the light fade to dusk. He thought of his sibling, of their laughter, of the bread balanced on her nose. He thought of the silver-haired man, of the stone still warm in his pocket. And in that moment, surrounded by shadows and quiet, he realized that wandering was not about finding new places, but about carrying familiar voices into unfamiliar spaces. When he finally returned home, his sibling asked where he had been. He described the forest in fragments, the tall trees, the muffled hum, the way the air seemed thick with memory. She listened intently, then said, "Next time, take me with you." He nodded. He had always known that wandering was sweeter when shared. The following week, they ventured together into the same forest. This time, it felt different. The siblings' laughter rang through the trees, bouncing off trunks, blending with bird calls. She skipped ahead, collecting leaves and twigs, placing them in her pockets as though each were a treasure. He followed, smiling, content simply to observe. Where he found stillness, she found play. Together they balanced the forest into something whole, mystery and joy, silence and sound. At one point they stumbled upon a small clearing where wildflowers bloomed in clusters of gold and violet. They lay down in the grass, staring up at the shifting sky, framed by branches. "Do you ever think the world is dreaming us?" she asked suddenly. He turned his head to look at her, surprised by the depth of the question. "Maybe," he replied softly. "Maybe we are the dream, and when we wander, the world is simply moving us through its thoughts." They both laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was too big to answer. And in that laughter was comfort. The forest became a place they returned to often. Sometimes together, sometimes alone. Each visit was different, shaped by weather, by season, by mood. Sometimes the hum was gentle, sometimes stern. Sometimes the air smelled of pine and damp earth, sometimes of blossoms and sunlit bark. The boy began to see wandering not as escape, but as communion. It was a way of saying yes to the world, of meeting it without demand. Outside the forest, life continued with its expected rhythms. School lessons, family dinners, chores, conversations. But the wandering seeped into everything. He found himself listening more closely to voices, noticing the small hesitations, the hidden warmth behind words. He found himself pausing to watch shadows stretch across walls, or to listen to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the same way he once listened to dripping water. Everywhere he went, he carried the forest, the field, the bench, the laughter, the hum. His sibling noticed the change in him. "You're quieter," she said one night as they lay awake in their beds. "Not in a sad way, more like, you're listening all the time." He smiled in the dark, unseen. "Maybe I am." She reached over and squeezed his hand. "Just don't forget to laugh too." He promised he wouldn't. Dreams followed him on his wanderings now. In sleep, he walked endless corridors lined with doors. Some opened onto the forest, others onto their home, others onto places he had never seen, but somehow knew. Each dream felt like another path, another wandering. He never rushed through them. He simply walked, touching the walls, listening to the hum that followed him everywhere. When he woke, he carried the dreams like maps drawn in invisible ink, guiding him even in daylight. And always there was the stone. He carried it in his pocket during his walks, turning it over in his hand, pressing it against his palm. It had become less of an object and more of a companion, a reminder that every step was connected to the man on the bench, to his siblings' laughter, to the hum that stitched the world together. The stone anchored him when he felt lost. It reminded him that wandering was not aimless, it was a form of belonging. As autumn settled in, with leaves falling like fragments of old stories, the boy and his siblings stood at the forest's edge once more. The air was cool, the ground soft with decay. They looked at each other and smiled, no words needed. Wandering had taught them both something they could not yet name. Perhaps it was patience. Perhaps it was reverence. Or perhaps it was simply the truth that to walk without rushing, to listen without demanding, was enough. They stepped into the trees again, side by side, letting the world dream them forward. And as the hum deepened around them, they felt both small and infinite, wandering not away from home, but deeper into it. Love came to him not as thunder or lightning, but as a quiet recognition, a soft unfolding of presence that had always been near. It did not announce itself with urgency. It slipped in gently like moonlight across a floor, barely noticed until everything was bathed in its glow. He first felt it on an ordinary day when a friend from school, someone who had often sat at the edges of the crowd, began walking home with him. She did not speak much, and he did not demand her words. They simply moved side by side, their footsteps falling into rhythm, the silence between them alive with meaning. She carried a notebook, always tucked under her arm, pages filled with sketches of places she had seen and places she wished existed. One afternoon, she opened it to show him a drawing of a house balanced on the curve of a hill, windows glowing like lanterns. "I don't know where it is," she whispered, "but it feels real to me." He studied the lines carefully, then said, "It looks like a memory we haven't had yet." She smiled, and in that smile was the beginning of something neither of them needed to name. His sibling noticed before he did. "You walk slower now when she's with you," she teased one evening, nudging him as they cleared the dishes. He blushed, not from shame, but from a recognition he could not yet articulate. Love was not sudden. It was steady, quiet, like the hum in the walls, like the laughter that lingered after it faded. The girl's presence shifted the way he saw the world. When she laughed, it was small, almost hidden, but it carried warmth that spread into him like fire beneath the skin. When she frowned, it was gentle, thoughtful, as though she was listening for something far away. He began to realize that her silences were as rich as his, filled not with emptiness but with unseen songs. One afternoon, they wandered together to the edge of the forest he loved. He hesitated, uncertain if she would understand the reverence he held for that place. But when they stepped beneath the trees, she grew quiet, her eyes widening, as though she too heard the muffled hum buried deep in the roots. "It feels like a cathedral," she whispered. He nodded, relieved, grateful. They sat on a fallen log, not speaking, listening together. When she finally reached for his hand, it was not dramatic, not trembling. It was steady, like the hum itself, like something that had always belonged. His sibling later asked, half mocking, half curious, "Do you love her?" He did not answer right away. Love, he thought, was too large for words, too tender to be pressed into the shape of a yes or no. Finally, he replied, "I think love is listening, and with her it's easy to listen." His sibling smirked but nodded, satisfied with the answer. In the weeks that followed, love did not alter the boy's life in sudden, sweeping ways. It deepened it. Moments grew layered, a shared glance held more weight. A silence carried comfort instead of uncertainty. The hum in the walls seemed to grow warmer, as though echoing this new bond. He found that when he held the stone in his hand, its warmth blended with the warmth of her presence, as if both carried the same truth. That connection could anchor the drifting self. One evening, as twilight draped the town, she showed him another sketch. This time it was of two figures standing on a bridge, their hands almost touching, the river flowing beneath. He recognized the bridge immediately. It was the one where he had once sat with his sibling, listening to water and sky.
"How did you know this place?" he asked softly. She shrugged. "I've never been there. It just came to me." A shiver of wonder passed through him. Somehow, she had drawn not only the place, but the memory, as if their paths had been echoing long before they crossed.
Their bond grew through small acts. She would leave a folded note in his book, a line of poetry scribbled quickly, often unfinished. He would press a wildflower between the pages of her notebook when she wasn't looking. They did not declare anything. They did not need to. The world itself seemed to speak for them, carrying their affection in whispers of wind, in the hush of rain, in the laughter that rose when they least expected it. The boy thought often of the silver-haired man during this time. He wondered if the man had known such a bond, if someone had once walked beside him in silence, holding the same truths. He remembered the phrase, "Still water remembers the sky," and for the first time it began to make sense. Love, too, was still water, steady, calm, reflecting more than it revealed. It was not loud, not rushing. It was the quiet surface that carried the shape of the infinite above. One night, lying awake, the boy imagined all the people in the world who carried quiet love like this, who shared glances instead of speeches, who held hands instead of promises. He thought of how many of them would never be remembered by history, never be named in books, yet their presence shaped everything. The hum in the walls seemed to affirm this, a chorus of unseen loves, countless and enduring, woven into the foundation of the world. His sibling grew curious about the girl, though she kept her curiosity playful. "Does she hear the walls too?" she asked. He thought carefully before answering.
"Not the same way."
"But she hears other things I don't." His sibling nodded, satisfied. She seemed to understand that love was not about sameness, but about complement, about two silences resonating together. Seasons shifted again, and with them came new memories. He and the girl sat beneath autumn leaves, watching them fall like fragments of golden fire. They walked home beneath winter skies, their breaths mingling in the cold air. In spring, they returned to the forest, where wildflowers bloomed, and she filled her notebook with sketches of blossoms she could not name. In summer, they sat by the river, letting the sound of water braid their silences together. Each season carried its own rhythm, and through them all, their bond deepened like roots growing unseen. There were days of distance, too, moments when misunderstanding stretched between them, when words failed, when silence felt heavier than usual. But even then the boy held to the truth he had learned, that listening was the heart of love. He listened, even when she could not speak, and she, in her own way, listened too. Slowly, gently, the distance always softened, giving way to connection once more. The boy realized that love did not demand perfection. It asked only for presence, and presence, he now knew, was the greatest gift anyone could offer. With his sibling, with his parents, with the silver-haired man, with the girl, presence had always been the thread weaving them together. Love was simply the name for when that thread glowed with warmth. As he drifted to sleep one night, he felt the stone in his hand, its weight familiar, steady. He thought of his siblings' laughter, of his parents' quiet smiles, of the silver-haired man's mysterious phrases, and of the girl's sketches glowing like lanterns. Together they formed a constellation of bonds, each star lighting the way forward. He closed his eyes, knowing that love was not a single flame, but a field of stars, endless and enduring, guiding him even through the darkest nights. The world seemed to slow that season, as though time itself had grown weary of rushing forward. Days stretched, not in urgency, but in softness, like fabric unrolled across a quiet room. The boy found himself pausing more often, lingering in doorways, resting his gaze on small details he once overlooked. Dust catching sunlight, the sway of curtains, the creak of a chair when no one moved. Life, he realized, was filled with whispers, and for the first time he felt strong enough to listen without needing answers. He carried his stone everywhere still, though less from habit and more from devotion. It felt different in his hand now, not simply a secret warmth, but a reminder of stillness itself. He would turn it slowly between his fingers while sitting on the porch, watching the late light fold into evening. The hum in the walls had not faded, but it no longer startled him. Instead, it seemed to deepen with each passing day,
resonating in his chest as if the house itself breathed with him. The girl often sat beside him during these evenings,
her notebook open but unused, her pencil resting lazily across the page. She did not need to draw every moment. Sometimes, she said, "It feels better just to be still." He nodded, grateful that she understood the language of silence so well. They would sit together for hours, not speaking, yet leaving the space between them full. Her presence was enough. His sibling noticed this shift too. "You're quieter now," she teased, though her tone held no mockery. "Like you're saving your words for something bigger." He smiled faintly. "Not bigger," he replied softly, "just slower." She tilted her head, studying him as though seeing something new. For a moment she said nothing, then added, "Slower isn't bad. It means you're noticing." One morning he woke before dawn and stepped outside alone. The air was cool, heavy with dew, and the world seemed suspended between night and day. He listened, not for voices, not for answers, but simply for the stillness. The quiet carried a weight, yet it was not oppressive. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, waiting. He closed his eyes and felt it seep into him, filling spaces he hadn't realized were empty. When the first bird called, it sounded less like a song and more like an announcement. The day is here.
and you are part of it. The silver-haired man returned in his thoughts often,
his words echoing like lanterns in the dark. Still water remembers the sky. He understood them differently now. It was not only about reflection, not only about holding fragments of the infinite. It was about patience, about the way calmness can cradle memory without needing to change it. In the still water of his days, he began to see everything more clearly. The joy in his siblings' laughter, the quiet grief in his mother's eyes when she thought no one noticed, the resilience in his father's silence, the gentleness in the girl's gaze. At times, he worried that stillness might make him disappear, that without constant motion he might fade from the world. But then he remembered how the hum in the walls never vanished, even when the house was silent. Presence, he realized, did not depend on noise. Presence was its own kind of sound, softer than speech, stronger than silence. The river became a place of pilgrimage for him. He would sit at its edge, legs folded, the stone warm in his palm, watching the water move endlessly. The surface reflected the sky, clouds drifting, light shifting, and beneath it the current carried stories unseen. He thought of his own life as that river, still on the surface at times, restless beneath, carrying both memory and possibility. The sound of water soothed him, reminding him that movement and stillness were not enemies, but companions. Sometimes the girl joined him there. She sketched the river's endless shapes, capturing waves with quick lines, then setting the pencil down to watch.
"No drawing can keep it," she admitted.
"It changes too fast," he smiled. "Maybe that's the point. We don't have to keep it. We just have to notice it." She looked at him then, eyes soft, and he felt the same warmth as when she first held his hand. It was a warmth not of possession, but of presence, as though she too understood that some things cannot be kept, only witnessed. Nights became slower too. He would lie in bed, the hum cradling him, the stone beside him on the table. Sometimes he dreamed of water, of forests, of voices carried in wind. Other times he dreamed of nothing, only darkness and rest, and he woke refreshed, as though silence itself had been enough to restore him. His sibling would sometimes wake in the night too, padding softly into his room to sit by the window. They rarely spoke during these moments. They just looked out together, watching stars, listening to the deep quiet that stretched between them. These small rituals became their unspoken bond, a way of saying, "I'm here," without words. The boy began to notice how the world itself taught him, not through lessons, but through presence. A candle burning low reminded him of patience. A cloud drifting reminded him of impermanence. A door creaking reminded him of time's passage. None of these things demanded explanation. They simply were, and in their being they gave him guidance. His love for the girl grew not through grand gestures, but through these same subtle moments. He noticed the way her hair caught light, the way her breathing slowed when she was at peace, the way her gaze softened when she listened. These details mattered more than declarations. He thought once about telling her everything, about confessing the fullness of what he felt. But he realized love was already alive between them, carried in silences and glances, needing no words to prove it. One evening, as the sun sank, he and his sibling and the girl sat together on the porch. The air smelled of rain, and the sky glowed with fading light.
None of them spoke.
They didn't need to. The silence was whole, filled with the hum of the house, the chirping of distant crickets, the breath of the earth itself. He felt then that he was not alone, had never been alone, and never would be. Presence was everywhere, woven into everything. When he finally went to bed that night, he felt a profound stillness within him, as though the hum, the river, the stone, the girl, his sibling, and even the silver-haired man were all threads in a single fabric, holding him gently. He understood now that life was not about racing forward, not about grasping or proving. It was about noticing, listening, allowing. He closed his eyes, the quiet enveloping him, and thought, if this is all there is, it is enough. If this is all there is, it is enough. And as he drifted into sleep, the hum seemed to whisper back, you are here. You are enough. You are remembered. The days after that seemed to drift together, less like a sequence of events and more like the weaving of a single, continuous thread. The boy noticed how his life had begun to carry a rhythm of its own, not dictated by clocks or calendars, but by the gentle pulse of presence. Mornings were filled with the quiet creak of floorboards, the faint smell of bread warming in the oven, and the way sunlight fell across the same corner of the table. Evenings brought the same slow dimming of light, the gathering of shadows, the soft hum rising from the walls like a lullaby. It was not repetition that gave these days meaning, but the stillness they carried, as though time itself was folding him into its patient arms. He began to feel a curious weight when he thought of memory, not a burden, but something tender, as though each moment was asking him to hold it gently before it slipped away. He realized that all the small things, the laughter of his sibling at an unfinished joke, the way the girl leaned her head into her hands when she listened, the sound of rain tapping against the window, were already becoming echoes layered inside him. Memory was no longer just recollection. It was presence extended, a way of keeping the world alive inside his chest. One evening, his sibling asked him softly, "Do you ever wonder what will stay with us and what will fade?" He thought for a long while before answering.
I think everything stays, he said finally. Even the things we forget.
They live somewhere, in the hum, in the river, in the silence. Nothing really disappears. It only changes its shape. She looked at him thoughtfully, as if turning his words over in her mind. Then she smiled faintly and said, "That makes me feel less afraid." The girl, too, seemed to sense the deepening of his reflections. She would sometimes watch him with an expression he couldn't quite name, half wonder, half recognition, as though she was seeing something familiar in him that even he hadn't discovered yet. Once, while sitting by the river, she whispered, "You remind me of the water."
Always moving but always still. He wanted to answer, but the words caught in his throat.
Instead, He only reached out and touched the cool stone in his pocket, feeling its quiet warmth steady him. Perhaps silence was the truest reply. That night, he dreamed of the silver-haired man again. The man stood at the edge of the river, his hands folded behind his back, eyes fixed on the horizon. "You're learning," the man said, his voice calm, unhurried, not through answers, but through presence. The boy asked what it all meant, why the world bent and hummed the way it did. But the man only smiled and said, "Meaning is not always found. Sometimes it's grown like moss on stone. It takes the shape of where it rests." When the boy woke, the words lingered, not as instructions but as echoes, guiding him gently, without force. The seasons began to shift, and with them came a subtle melancholy. Leaves fell, carpeting the streets in amber and gold. The air grew sharper, carrying the scent of wood smoke and rain. Change was gentle yet undeniable. He watched it unfold with both awe and quiet sadness. For every falling leaf, he felt the reminder that nothing holds its shape forever. Yet even in this truth there was peace. For just as leaves returned in spring, so too did presence return in new forms. The cycle was not loss, but continuation. His sibling grew restless during those days, speaking often of journeys she wished to take, places she longed to see beyond the edges of their town. He listened with patience, his heart tugged between understanding and reluctance. He knew she was not meant to stay forever. Her spirit carried the same restlessness as the wind that rattled the windows at night. Still, the thought of her absence left a hollow space in him. He held this quietly, never letting it turn into fear, only into tenderness. For love, he realized, was not about holding tight, but about allowing. The girl stayed near, her sketches filling with images of branches stripped bare, rivers swelling with autumn rains, the glow of lamps through misted glass. Sometimes she showed him her drawings, though she often left the most beautiful ones hidden, as though some moments were too fragile to reveal.
He didn't mind.
He knew not everything was meant to be shared. Some things were sacred precisely because they were kept within. Their bond deepened not through constant words, but through the spaces they gave each other, the patience to let silence say what language could not. One late afternoon, they returned to the old bridge together. The boards creaked under their steps, the water below moving with more urgency than in summer. They leaned against the railing, watching ripples scatter the reflection of the sky. After a long silence, she said, "Do you think the world notices us as much as we notice it?" He thought carefully before answering.
"I think it does."
"Maybe not in the way we expect, but in the way the river remembers every stone and the wind remembers every tree. The world carries us, even when we forget." She let out a soft sigh, leaning closer, and he felt the warmth of her shoulder against his. The hum within him deepened, resonant, steady. As days shortened and nights grew longer, he found himself increasingly drawn to reflection. Not the kind that demanded resolution, but the kind that held space. He realized that life did not need to resolve like a story. It only needed to flow like the river, each moment carrying into the next. His siblings' laughter, the girl's gaze, the hum in the walls, the memory of the silver-haired man, these were not separate threads but a single weaving, a tapestry without beginning or end. One evening, while the sky glowed faintly with stars, he sat on the porch with the stone in his hand. He thought of everything he had carried, everything that had carried him. He thought of stillness, of presence, of memory. He thought of love in its quietest form. Not a shout, not a claim, but a steady warmth, like the hum that had always been there. And he whispered softly, to no one and to everything at once, "Thank you." The night air seemed to respond, wrapping him in its gentle coolness, filling him with the certainty that his gratitude had been heard, not by a person, not by a figure in the sky, but by the world itself. the same world that bent and whispered, that remembered and carried. He felt lighter, not because he had found answers, but because he had learned to live without needing them. He closed his eyes, letting the silence fold over him, and for the first time he understood that stillness was not the absence of movement. Stillness was the presence of everything, gathered softly in one place, waiting to be noticed. The days continued their quiet unfolding, each one layered with the softness of the last, as though life had chosen to speak in whispers rather than shouts. The boy, now older in ways that were not measured by years but by stillness, found himself walking more slowly through familiar places. Streets he had known since childhood seemed different, not because they had changed, but because his eyes had. He noticed the way cracks in the pavement carried tiny gardens of moss. He noticed how windows glowed differently in the mornings than in the evenings, as though houses themselves breathed with time. These details no longer felt trivial. They felt like the small truths the world had been waiting for him to see. The hum in the walls remained constant, steady as ever, though he no longer questioned it. It had become part of him, a presence he trusted without explanation. At night, when sleep pressed against his eyelids, he let the hum carry him downward, like a boat being lowered gently into water. In the mornings, when he woke, it greeted him again, quiet yet undeniable. He realized that this sound, this endless pulse, had been his first teacher. It had shown him how to listen, how to trust silence, how to dwell in the unseen without fear. His sibling had grown taller, her spirit stretched outward, full of restless longing. She spoke more often of leaving, of journeys across oceans and mountains, of streets that belonged to cities far beyond their small town. He listened to her dreams with both pride and ache. The ache was not because he doubted her, but because he knew she was not meant to stay, and that meant, one day, the house would feel emptier. Yet he never tried to hold her back. Love, he had learned, was not a cage, but a door left open. To love her meant to watch her walk through it, carrying with her the laughter and secrets they had shared. The girl remained his companion, steady and gentle. Their bond deepened without grand declarations, woven instead through countless small gestures. The way she placed her sketchbook between them without needing to explain, the way her eyes softened when she saw him at the edge of a crowd, the way silence between them never pressed, but only rested. She drew less now, not because she had lost interest, but because she said she wanted to experience more without capturing it. Some things are too alive to be pinned down, she explained one afternoon, as they watched the river swell with rain. He agreed, holding her hand, feeling the hum stretch between them like a shared heartbeat. Autumn ripened into winter, and with it came a deepening quiet. Snow fell gently, covering the streets in blankets of light. The world seemed muted, softened at the edges. He loved these nights most of all, when the only sound was the crunch of footsteps on powder and the distant crack of ice shifting in the river. The town, usually filled with movement and voices, slowed into something dreamlike. He walked through it with reverence, each breath visible, each moment heavy with stillness. Winter felt like a mirror to his own heart, quiet, reflective, yet alive beneath the surface. One evening, he sat by the fire with his sibling and the girl. Shadows danced across the walls, flickering like forgotten memories. His sibling told stories of places she had read about, her voice alive with wonder, while the girl listened, sketching absent-mindedly in the margins of her book. He said little, but he felt everything: joy, sorrow, hope, longing, all layered together like threads of a tapestry. It struck him then how life was not a sequence of answers, but a collection of presences. Every person, every sound, every silence, every dream, woven together into something larger than any single moment. The stone remained by his side, always warm, always grounding. He no longer held it for comfort, but for connection. It was a reminder of where he had come from, of the hum that had carried him since childhood, of the silver-haired man who had spoken truths without explanation. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he imagined placing the stone in the river, letting it drift away to carry its warmth into other hands. But each time he tried to picture it, he felt the stone pulse faintly, as if it belonged with him a little longer. So he kept it, not as possession, but as companionship. One afternoon, he returned to the bridge alone. Snow covered its boards, and the river below moved sluggishly, carrying ice along its surface. He leaned against the railing and let the cold seep into his skin, his breath rising in visible clouds. For a long time he said nothing, only listened. The river groaned and whispered, the air hummed faintly, and he felt the presence of everything he loved. The silver-haired man's words came back to him then, not as memory but as living truth. Meaning grows like moss. He realized he no longer needed to seek meaning in grand places. It was already here, in the river, in the snow, in his siblings' laughter, in the girl's quiet gaze. Meaning was everywhere, if only he stayed still long enough to see it. That night, his sibling came into his room and sat beside him, her voice softer than usual. "I think I'll leave soon," she said, not looking at him.
"Not forever, but—"
"For a while?" He nodded slowly, the ache rising but not overwhelming.
"I know," he replied gently.
"You're meant to." She turned to him then, her eyes shimmering in the low light. "Will you be all right?" He smiled faintly, touching the stone beside him. "Yes," he whispered, "because you'll always be here, even when you're away." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and for a long while they sat in silence, the hum carrying them both. The girl stayed after his sibling left, though she too carried her own restlessness. Together they filled the quiet spaces of winter with companionship. They walked the snowy streets, leaving footprints that disappeared by morning. They watched stars glitter in skies, so clear it felt like the universe was leaning close to listen. They sat by the fire, speaking little, their silences filled with unspoken truths. Their love was not dramatic, not made of fireworks or promises, but of presence. Two souls choosing to notice each other in a world already filled with wonder. As winter stretched on, he found himself reflecting more often on legacy. Not legacy as the world defined it, not achievements or monuments, but the legacy of presence. What would remain when he was gone? Perhaps not his words, nor even his actions, but the way he had made others feel, seen, heard, held. He hoped his sibling would carry that feeling with her across oceans. He hoped the girl would remember their silences as clearly as their laughter. He hoped the hum in the walls would whisper to someone else one day, teaching them stillness the way it had taught him. And so, as snow fell silently outside his window, he closed his eyes and allowed himself to rest in that thought. Legacy was not built in grand gestures. Legacy was simply the echo of presence, carried forward by memory and love. He breathed in, breathed out, and felt the hum rise to meet him, steady, eternal, enough. The days after his sibling's departure carried a quiet unfamiliarity, like a room rearranged in the night. The house seemed larger now, its corners stretched by absence. Her laughter no longer echoed from the stairs, her hurried footsteps no longer rattled the floorboards. Yet, in subtle ways, she remained. A scarf draped carelessly over the back of a chair, sketches folded between pages of old books, the faint echo of her voice when the hum in the walls deepened. Presence, he realized, did not leave. It shifted, changed its form, found new ways of being. He carried her with him, not as a memory locked in the past, but as a living thread woven into every silence he now walked through. The girl stayed near, though she too was touched by the quiet. She would often pause before speaking, as though aware of the absence that filled the air. Sometimes she asked about his siblings' travels, and he would repeat the words from letters that arrived on folded paper, ink smudged by unfamiliar rains. "The city is louder than I imagined," one letter said. "But even in the noise I hear the hum you spoke of. It's softer, but it's there." Reading those words aloud, he felt both joy and longing. It comforted him to know she carried the same hum, yet it deepened his awareness of her distance. One night he dreamt again of the silver-haired man. This time the man sat across from him at the edge of a fire, its flames low and steady. Neither spoke at first. The man's eyes, gentle and unhurried, seemed to hold centuries. Finally he said, "Absence is not emptiness. It is space for what has been left behind to grow within you." The boy wanted to ask what he should do with such space, but the man only smiled and added, "Trust the silence. It teaches more than words." When he awoke, he carried the dream with him like a lantern. The seasons shifted again. Winter's silence gave way to the slow awakening of spring. Snow melted into streams that sang with renewed life. Buds appeared on branches, fragile yet determined. He watched the earth awaken and felt his own heart stir in rhythm. Absence still lived beside him, but it no longer weighed heavy. It had become part of the cycle, part of the pattern that returned with the turning of seasons. Change was not a theft, he realized, but a transformation. He and the girl walked often in those days, their paths winding through fields soft with new grass. She collected wildflowers, tucking them between the pages of her notebook. He carried the stone in his pocket still, though sometimes he left it behind, trusting that its warmth lived within him now. On one such walk, she said quietly, "Do you ever wonder what people will remember of us?" He thought carefully, letting the question settle. "Not what we did," he said at last, "but how we made them feel. The world forgets actions, but it never forgets presence." She nodded, pressing a flower into her book, and whispered, "Then I hope we are remembered kindly. I hope we are remembered kindly." At the river, where the bridge sagged but held, he began to notice new layers of sound. The rush of water seemed deeper, carrying voices that felt both ancient and near. Once he leaned over and whispered his sibling's name, and for a moment he swore the river replied, carrying her laughter back to him in the curl of its current. He smiled through tears, not questioning whether it was imagination or truth. The line between the two no longer mattered. What mattered was the feeling, the reassurance that presence could travel across distance, that love could bend like water, finding its way back in unexpected forms. The girl began to draw again, though her sketches now carried more emptiness within them, fields with wide horizons, rivers stretching into distance, stars suspended in endless skies. When he asked about it, she said, "I think I'm learning to draw space. The places between things matter just as much as the things themselves." He admired her for this, for the way she saw absence, not as loss, but as invitation. Together they filled their days with such quiet recognitions, noticing more, needing less. Sometimes at night, he would sit alone on the porch, watching the stars prick the darkness. He found himself speaking softly, not to anyone in particular, but to the hum, to the world, to whatever might be listening.
"I don't need answers," he whispered one night.
"Only to know I belong." The breeze that stirred in reply felt like enough, brushing his skin gently, reminding him that belonging was not earned. It simply was. The stone grew heavier in his hand over time, not in weight, but in meaning. He began to understand that it had always been a mirror, reflecting not power, but presence. Its warmth was his own warmth, returned to him. Its silence was his silence, deepened. He thought often of releasing it, perhaps leaving it by the river for another to find. But each time he held it a little longer, as though waiting for the right moment when letting go would feel less like loss, and more like offering. Letters continued to arrive from his sibling, carrying fragments of distant skies and crowded streets. She wrote of strangers who reminded her of home, of nights when she missed the hum, of mornings when she felt the world bending just as it had in childhood. "I think of you when the wind moves strangely," she wrote once. "It feels like you're still with me." Reading those words aloud to the girl, he felt tears rise again, though they did not sting. They felt cleansing, like rain sliding down a window, blurring the line between inside and out. He realized then that presence did not require closeness. It only required openness, the willingness to feel, to remember, to let absence speak as loudly as nearness. This truth gave him peace. His sibling was not gone. She was simply stretched across the world, her presence woven into places he had not yet seen. As spring ripened, he began to notice how endings and beginnings blurred together. The fall of a blossom was also the promise of fruit. The melting of snow was also the birth of rivers. His own heart, once restless with questions, now carried more acceptance. He no longer asked why the world bent, why the hum persisted, why absence ached. Instead, he let these mysteries rest within him like seeds planted in soil. Their growth was not his to control, only to nurture with attention. One evening, as the sun set behind a horizon swollen with color, he sat with the girl by the river. They spoke little, their hands intertwined, the water carrying its endless song. After a long silence, he whispered, "Do you think the world is listening to us now?" She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the fading light, and said, "I think it always has been." In that moment, he felt a deep calm, as though every absence, every presence, every hum, every silence had led to this. Not an answer, not a conclusion, but a belonging too vast to name. When night came, he lay awake listening to the steady breath of the house, the hum alive in its walls, the stone resting on the table beside him. He thought of his sibling beneath other stars, of the girl sleeping gently in her own room, of the silver-haired man walking somewhere unseen. He thought of the river, of the bridge, of the countless presences that had shaped him, and he felt not sadness, not longing, but a quiet gratitude that seemed to fill every corner of him. The summer that followed seemed to unfold more slowly than any he could remember. Days stretched long, not in urgency but in languid ease, like pages turning gently in a book no one was rushing to finish. The air was warm and heavy, carrying scents of wild grass and distant rain. Even the hum in the walls softened, no longer trembling like an urgent whisper, but humming more like a lullaby, steady and kind. He found himself lingering in those hours of stillness, letting time expand without measurement. It felt as though life had become less about doing and more about being, less about seeking and more about noticing. The girl shared her drawings with him more often now. They had grown different, less precise, more fluid, as though she had stopped trying to control the lines and instead allowed them to wander where they wished. One evening, as cicadas sang and the first stars lit the sky, she showed him a sketch of a small figure walking on an endless road beneath bending skies.
"It's you," she said softly.
"Though maybe it's all of us." He studied the picture for a long time, noting how the figure seemed both alone and accompanied, how the sky bent but never broke. He whispered, "It feels like a dream I've had but forgotten." She only smiled, closing the book gently, as though tucking the dream back into safety. Letters from his sibling arrived less often, though never without warmth. Each one carried both distance and closeness, like voices spoken through a long tunnel. She wrote of strangers who had become companions, of places where the hum was hidden deep beneath stone streets, of nights when she looked up at unfamiliar constellations and thought of home. "It's strange," one letter confessed. "The farther I go, the more I feel you near me. as if the distance only makes the presence louder. He read those words aloud on the porch, his voice catching softly. The girl, listening beside him, said, "Maybe that's what love does. It finds ways to stretch, to echo, to keep reminding us it's still there." The river grew slower with summer heat, its surface glassy, reflecting skies that bent like an endless mirror. He visited it often, resting on the bank where grass grew high. Sometimes he brought the stone, placing it on the ground beside him, letting the sun warm it until it pulsed gently in his palm. He no longer clutched it with the same urgency he had once felt. Now he held it with gratitude, as though thanking it for having taught him patience, for teaching him that presence was not something to chase, but something to recognize. One evening he felt the need to speak aloud, though no one was near. He whispered to the river, to the sky, to the air that trembled faintly with the hum. "I am learning," he said, his voice steady but low. "I am learning that silence is not empty.
I am learning that love is not bound.
I am learning that the world bends not to test us, but to remind us we belong to something wider." The words did not echo back, but the hush that followed felt like an answer, a confirmation too deep for sound. The girl sometimes asked about the silver-haired man from his dreams. He had told her of him once, in a quiet moment when words came easily. She seemed fascinated, though not in a way that demanded explanation. "Do you think he's real?" she asked. He thought for a long moment before replying, "I think reality is not the point. He is present in the way the hum is present, in the way absence is present."
Real enough to change me. She accepted this without question, as though truth could take many forms.
Later that night, she sketched a figure with silver hair standing by a doorway of stars, and though she never showed him that drawing, he felt it nonetheless. As the season lingered, he noticed how memories had softened inside him. The sting of his sibling's absence was no longer sharp. It had become a tender ache, like the warmth left behind when someone rises from a chair. He carried her not in longing, but in gratitude, letting the echoes of their shared laughter become lanterns in the darker corners of his days. Sometimes he would catch himself smiling at nothing, realizing it was a memory brushing past, light as breath. This shift brought him peace.
Absence was not a wound, but a shadow that proved light had once been. He and the girl began to share more silences, comfortable and unhurried.
They sat side by side on the porch or wandered along the edge of fields without speaking. These silences carried more than words ever could. They carried trust and recognition and the quiet knowledge that presence does not always need to declare itself. One night, under a swelling moon, she whispered,
"I don't think silence is empty anymore." He nodded,
his chest swelling with quiet gratitude, and replied, "I don't think it ever was." The hum in the walls began to change, though he could not say how. It felt less like something outside of him and more like something inside, resonating gently through his ribs, in the rhythm of his steps, in the calm of his breath. He realized that what he had once searched for in the world had always been within him, waiting patiently for recognition. This understanding brought both relief and humility. He did not need to grasp the hum, nor explain it, nor prove it. He only needed to listen, to honor its presence, to let it guide him quietly forward. One afternoon, as he walked alone toward the river, he came upon a child playing by the water's edge. She was skipping stones, her laughter ringing bright against the slow current. She looked up and handed him a smooth pebble, saying, "This one's lucky." He smiled and tossed it into the water, watching it ripple outward in widening circles. For a moment, he thought of the stone he carried, how it too had been a gift, how it too had set circles in motion within him. The child's laughter carried him back to memories of his own youth, to days when wonder was simple and unquestioned. He thanked her quietly before walking on, feeling the weight of gratitude anchor him gently. That night, as he lay in bed, He thought of the circles, stone to river, laughter to memory, presence to absence. Everything seemed to move in ripples, expanding outward, never ending where it began. He felt himself as one circle among many, touched by others, touching others in turn. This thought did not overwhelm him. Instead, it soothed him, reminding him that nothing was ever truly lost. It only became part of a larger pattern, one that bent and stretched but never broke. As summer reached its height, the days glowed golden, and nights were heavy with stars. He and the girl sat once more by the river, the air thick with the hum of crickets. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they listened together to the water's endless song. After a long silence, she murmured, "Do you think we'll be remembered?" He closed his eyes, breathing in the warmth of the moment, and replied, "I think we already are."
By the river, by the hum.
By each other. In that stillness, with stars above and water below, he felt a peace so deep it seemed to settle not only in his body, but in the very air around him. It was not an ending nor a beginning. It was simply presence, enough, complete, eternal in its quiet way. The last stretch of days seemed to arrive not with fanfare, but with a hush, like a candle dimming slowly, leaving behind its warmth. He felt it in the way the air grew softer, in the way the evenings stretched longer, in the way his own thoughts seemed to move with greater patience. It was not that life was ending, but that a chapter was folding itself gently, leaving only traces of ink and memory. He welcomed this hush, sensing that it was not loss, but a transition into something wider, something he could not yet name. The girl noticed it too. She lingered more often at the river, her notebook closed in her lap, her eyes lifted towards skies that bent like silent guardians.
"It feels like we're nearing the end of a story," she whispered once, her voice fragile but calm.
He looked at her, then at the horizon, and replied, "Maybe, or maybe we're just at the part where stories begin again." She nodded, as though she already knew this, as though her silence was its own kind of understanding. The letters from his siblings slowed until they no longer came, yet he did not grieve. He had learned by now that absence was never empty. Somewhere she was walking beneath other skies, breathing the same wind that would one day drift back to him. He imagined her laughing in a distant market, or pausing by a window to listen to the hum in a stranger's house. Her silence was not distance, it was simply another shape of presence, invisible but intact. He carried her as easily as breath. On one quiet evening, he felt drawn once more to the river. The stone weighed steady in his pocket, its warmth no longer a surprise, but a comfort. He stood at the water's edge, listening to the ripples carry on endlessly, the surface reflecting the sky as if both belonged to the same vast mirror. Slowly, with hands that did not tremble, he drew the stone out and held it against the last light of dusk. It glowed faintly in his palm, not with magic, but with memory, with gratitude, with love. After a moment he bent low and set it gently on the bank. He did not throw it, did not release it with force. He only placed it down, as one might place a lantern for another to find. And then he walked away, lighter, not because he had lost something, but because he had shared it. The house welcomed him back with its familiar hum, yet he no longer heard it as something outside himself. It lived within him now, woven into his very breath. Every step he took, every quiet pause, every glance toward the horizon seemed to echo with that presence. He realized he had carried the hum all along. The walls had only reminded him. This truth was gentle, not heavy. It felt like a lullaby, one that had always been singing beneath the noise of his days. The girl, sensing his peace, rested her head against his shoulder that night. "You've changed," she murmured, almost to herself. He smiled softly, not needing to ask how. He only whispered, "So have you." And in that moment, neither needed more. Their silence was complete. Their presence was enough. Seasons turned once more, though he counted them less. The fields grew golden, then bare, then alive again. Each cycle carried echoes of the ones before, like verses in a song that never ended, only shifted in key. He moved with them easily, no longer searching for answers, but trusting the rhythm. He learned to see the world as a series of ripples, widening outward, carrying presence farther than eyes could follow. In dreams, the silver-haired man returned one last time. They sat once more by the quiet fire, its glow steady and kind. The man looked at him with eyes that seemed older than sky, and said only, "You've learned what you needed." The boy, no longer a boy, yet not aged in his dream, asked softly, "What now?" The man's smile was tender, almost amused. "Now you live.
Now you listen.
Now you become the presence you once sought." And with that, the dream faded, not abruptly, but gently, like mist dissolving into air. He woke with peace, as though he had been given not instructions but permission. In the final weeks of that summer, he and the girl visited the bridge one last time together. Its wood creaked beneath their steps, its rails worn smooth by years of weather, yet it held. They stood at its center, the river curling beneath them, the sky bending above.
"Do you hear it?" he asked.
She closed her eyes, listening.
"Yes," she whispered.
"It sounds like everything and nothing at once." He nodded, letting the silence after her words stretch long. Then, with a calm he had never known before, he said, "That's the sound of belonging, belonging." When they returned home that evening, the house felt different, though nothing had changed. Its corners were the same, its walls carried the same hum, its windows looked out on the same horizon. Yet it was no longer simply a place. It was a memory, a presence, a vessel for everything they had become. He realized then that home was not made of wood or walls, but of presence, of the echoes we leave behind, of the silences that hold us gently. The days that followed blurred softly, like colors in twilight. Each moment seemed to fold into the next without urgency. He did not need to know what would come, nor did he fear it. The hum lived in him, the river carried him, the stars watched over him, and love stretched across distances he no longer measured. This was enough. This was everything. And so, when night deepened and the air cooled, he lay down with gratitude in his chest, his breath steady, his heart unburdened. The girl rested nearby, the world turned slowly outside, and the hum wove its quiet lullaby through them both. He thought one last time of his sibling, of the silver-haired man, of the river, of the stone. He thought of absence and presence, of silence and song, of love that stretched without end. And with a final whisper, he said to the world, "I am here.
"I am listening."
Thank you." The stars bent closer. The night grew gentle, and sleep embraced him like an old friend. He did not resist. He only drifted, carrying with him the soft truth that nothing is ever truly gone, and everything is always part of something greater. And somewhere, in rivers, in skies, in laughter, carried by wind, he would always remain. And with that he stretched into the stars, and now the story rests. It has carried us through strange beginnings, gentle awakenings, tender bonds, and quiet reflections. If you've listened this far, know that you are part of its circle now. The hum belongs to you too. Let its calm stay with you, in your breath, in your dreams, in the silences that cradle you tonight. Stories don't end, not really. They soften, they echo, they wait for you to return whenever you need comfort. So rest easy, let go of the weight of the day, and remember, presence is never lost, love is never far, and you are always enough. Thank you for sharing this time with us. Sleep peacefully. Everything is going to be okay.